My son-in-law handed me a bright orange life jacket before we even stepped onto the gangway and loudly joked to his friends that I needed to stay seated so I would not get sick on a real boat. I did not correct him. I did not raise my voice. I simply took the jacket and folded it neatly across my lap. He had no idea that in exactly 48 hours, he would be on his knees on a flooded deck, begging me to take the wheel of that very vessel just to keep us all breathing. Before we get into the deep water of this story, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are tuning in from today. I always love reading where this community is watching from. My name is Marguerite. I am 69 years old. For 40 years of my life, I was a merchant marine captain. I did not drive little pleasure cruisers. I commanded cargo vessels the size of city blocks across the Pacific Ocean. I spent my life reading the horizon, feeling the shift in barometric pressure in my joints, and anticipating storms long before the first drop of rain ever hit the glass. A ship does not sink because of the water around it. It sinks because of the water that gets inside. I really should have applied that exact same logic to my own family a long time ago. I never talked much about my career after I retired. I packed away my heavy canvas sea bag, moved into a quiet little house on the coast, and kept my memories to myself. When my daughter Elena married Richard 10 years ago, I saw immediately what kind of man he was. Richard is a man who measures a person by the brand of their watch and the size of their investment portfolio. He never once asked what I actually did for a living. He looked at my faded jeans, my calloused hands, and just assumed I was a frail old woman who spent her days feeding seagulls down at the local pier. To him, I was just Elena's quiet, slightly embarrassing mother, someone to be tolerated, someone to be managed. I remember the constant vibration of a 10 to 1,000 horsepower diesel engine humming through the soles of my work boots. It is a feeling that gets into your bones and never really leaves. It teaches you absolute patience. It teaches you that the ocean does not care about your ego, your bank account, or how loudly you can yell out there. Competence is the only currency that matters. But Richard lived in a world made entirely of ego. He lived on appearances, and he was about to invite me into his world, on his terms, just to prove how small he thought I was. He thought he was in absolute control of the environment. But you can never control the weather, and you can certainly never control the sea. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee and listening to the local weather radio. I still use a landline. It has a solid, heavy receiver that feels grounded in your hand. When it rang, the caller ID simply said, "Richard." I picked it up and said hello. I was immediately hit with the sound of highway wind and the distorted, loud echo of a luxury car's Bluetooth system. Richard never just called you. He broadcasted himself to you. Marguerite? His voice boomed through the static. Listen. Elena and I are putting together a little weekend trip for our 10th anniversary. We rented a yacht, a real one, not those little tugboats you used to mess around with down at the docks. I did not say anything. I just let the hum of the open road fill the silence on the line. I spent 40 years hauling millions of tons of steel across typhoons in the South China Sea. But to Richard, I was just a woman who liked to fish in the bay. I never corrected him because a man like Richard does not actually listen to corrections. He only listens to his own echo. Anyway, he continued, completely unfazed by my silence. Elena really wanted you there. I told her it might be too much for you, being out on the open water at your age. But she insisted. We are heading out this Friday for a 2-day cruise. Before I could answer, his tone shifted. It dropped from loudly casual to quietly commanding. It was the exact tone he used when he was negotiating a real estate deal and wanted to establish absolute dominance in the room. Now, listen, he said. I am bringing a few very important clients along on this trip. High net worth individuals. Investors who are looking closely at my next big project. I need everything to be absolutely perfect. So, I need you to do me a favor. Just try to blend in. Okay, dress nice. Do not wear those faded denim shirts you always wear. And please, do not corner my clients and tell them those boring fishing stories. Just sit back, enjoy the buffet, and let me handle the entertaining. I just do not want you getting seasick and ruining the vibe for everyone. I heard Elena's voice faintly in the background. She sounded small. She sounded incredibly far away. She just said, "Please." "Mom?" That was the only reason I said yes. When Elena was a little girl, she used to stand on the docks and watch my freighter come into port. She was fearless. She loved the smell of the salt and the diesel. But 10 years with Richard had slowly eroded that fire. He did not break her all at once. He chipped away at her confidence, day by day, correcting her posture, criticizing her clothes, managing her friendships, until she became a perfectly polished, completely silent accessory to his ambition. I did not say yes for the yacht. I did not say yes for the free champagne. I said yes because my daughter sounded like a guest in her own marriage. I will be there. Richard, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. I will not cause any trouble. I heard him exhale. A sharp, dismissive breath. Great. Be at the marina at 8 in the morning. And Marguerite, take some motion sickness pills before you board. Seriously, I cannot have you throwing up in front of the board of directors. He hung up before I could say goodbye. I put the heavy receiver back on the hook. I looked out my kitchen window toward the gray horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. I did not feel angry. Anger is a useless emotion on the water. Anger makes you blind to the horizon. Instead, I felt a deep, steady calm settling over me. He thought he was inviting a fragile old woman into his empire. He thought he was giving me a charity ticket to a world I could not possibly comprehend. I walked into my bedroom and pulled my old canvas sea bag from the back of the closet. It smelled like salt and machine oil, a smell that never truly washes out. I did not pack evening gowns. I did not pack expensive resort wear. I packed a heavy woolen sweater. I packed my steel-toed deck boots. I packed my analog barometer, a solid brass instrument that has predicted more sudden squalls than any shiny new tablet computer ever could. I also packed a small, waterproof flashlight and my old rigging knife. A younger version of me would have called Richard back and told him exactly where he could shove his invitation. But age teaches you to wait. It teaches you to let a man talk. Because a man who cannot stop talking will eventually tell you exactly how to defeat him. I knew exactly what kind of vessel he had chartered. People like Richard do not rent working boats. They rent floating luxury hotels with massive windows and zero center of gravity. They rent boats built for drinking champagne in the harbor, not for surviving a drop in barometric pressure. The next 3 days passed quietly. I checked the marine forecast every morning. The local news promised clear skies and calm waters for the entire weekend. But the local news only looks at the surface. They do not look at the invisible pressure systems building hundreds of miles offshore. My joints were already aching. The air in my garden felt completely still, heavy, and thick. It was the kind of absolute silence that only happens right before the atmosphere violently tears itself apart. I zipped up my canvas bag. I was ready for Friday. Friday morning arrived with a deceptive, brilliant blue sky, the kind of sky that makes tourists think the ocean is their friend. I drove my old pickup truck down to the marina. Arriving exactly at 8 o'clock, This was not the working waterfront where I had spent my life. There were no rusty trawlers here. There were no cranes loading shipping containers. And there was absolutely no smell of diesel or sweat. This was a private luxury harbor. It smelled like expensive sunscreen. Freshly scrubbed fiberglass. And catered breakfasts. I parked at the far end of the lot and carried my weathered canvas sea bag over my shoulder. It was heavy, packed with my steel-toed boots, my heavy woolen sweaters, and my brass instruments. As I walked down the long wooden dock, I spotted them. Richard was standing at the base of the gangway, holding court. The vessel he had chartered was called the Apex Return. It was a ridiculous name for a ridiculous boat. It was easily 120 feet of gleaming white fiberglass, stacked 3 decks high. To the untrained eye, it looked like a palace on the water. To a merchant marine captain, it looked like a floating liability. It had an incredibly shallow draft and an absurd amount of top weight. It was essentially a glass hotel built on a surfboard. It was designed for drinking champagne in flat water, not for taking a broadside wave in a sudden pressure drop. I stopped about 30 feet away and just watched them for a moment. Richard was wearing a crisp white linen shirt and pressed navy trousers. He looked exactly like a man playing the role of a seasoned yachtsman in a magazine advertisement. Elena stood slightly behind him. She was wearing a beautiful summer dress, but her shoulders were hunched, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Surrounding them were Richard's VIP guests. There were 2 older men in designer sunglasses, and a woman holding a tiny dog in a leather carrier. These were the high-net-worth individuals Richard had warned me about, the investors he was trying to secure for his next real estate syndicate. At the feet of this group sat a mountain of luggage. There were matching sets of Louis Vuitton suitcases, hard-shelled silver travel cases, and oversized garment bags. It looked like they were packing for a month in Monaco, not a 48-hour trip up the coast. I walked up to the group, the heavy brass buckles on my sea bag clinking quietly. Richard saw me and immediately stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked me up and down. He took in my heavy denim jacket, my faded work jeans, and the worn canvas bag slung over my shoulder. A flash of pure, undisguised irritation crossed his face before he plastered on a bright, artificial smile. "Marguerite," Richard said, his voice entirely too loud. "You made it, and you brought whatever that is." He gestured dismissively toward my bag. The VIP guests turned to look at me. The woman with the dog let her eyes drag slowly from my practical boots up to my gray hair. She did not smile. One of the men, a tall guy with a silver watch that probably cost more than my first house, raised an eyebrow. "Everyone," Richard announced, adopting a tone of exaggerated patience. "This is Elena's mother, Marguerite. We thought it would be nice to get her out of the house for a couple of days. Give her some fresh air. Marguerite. This is Marcus Vance, his associate David, and Marcus's wife, Sylvia." Marcus gave me a tight, flat nod. "Pleasure," he said, in a tone that made it perfectly clear it was no pleasure at all. Marguerite used to putter around on little fishing boats down by the public docks. Richard continued, turning back to his investors with a chuckle. "So I figured she would get a kick out of seeing what a real vessel looks like up close." Elena flinched. She looked at me, her eyes pleading with me not to cause a scene. I held her gaze for a split second. I wanted her to see that I was not broken by this. I was not even insulted. I did not correct Richard. I did not tell Marcus Vance that the little fishing boats I puttered around on were actually 600-foot cargo ships carrying 10,000 tons of steel across the Pacific Ring of Fire. I did not tell them that I had navigated through typhoons that would snap this shiny fiberglass toy entirely in half. I simply nodded. It is a very clean boat. Richard, I said evenly. Richard puffed out his chest, clearly taking my observation as a profound compliment. He mistook my calm demeanor for intimidation. He looked at Marcus with a knowing smirk, as if to say, "Look at this simple old woman being dazzled by my wealth." He felt completely in control. He felt that he had successfully established the social hierarchy before we even set foot on the deck. I was the charity case, and he was the king. "All right, let us get boarded." Richard clapped his hands together. "The crew will handle the bags. Marguerite, just leave that heavy thing on the dock. One of the deckhands will bring it to your cabin. Assuming it does not leak oil on the teak wood." The investors chuckled politely. I slipped the canvas strap off my shoulder, but I did not hand it to the young, nervous-looking deckhand who hurried over. "I can carry my own gear," I said quietly. "I always have." I walked past Richard, past the mountain of designer luggage, and stepped onto the gangway. I felt the slight shift of the vessel under my boots. It felt loose. It felt entirely disconnected from the ocean beneath it. I walked up the ramp and stepped onto the polished deck, carrying my own weight. Exactly as I had done for 40 years. I did not know yet just how bad the weather was going to get. But as I looked up at the massive glass windows of the bridge, I knew one thing for absolute certain. This ship was entirely unprepared for the reality of the ocean. And so were the people on it. The moment I stepped inside the main salon of the Apex Return, the smell of the ocean vanished entirely. On a real ship, you can never completely escape the sea. The salt gets into the canvas. The smell of diesel settles into the metal, and the dampness becomes a permanent part of the air. But inside this vessel, the air was heavily climate-controlled. It smelled like expensive citrus cologne. Fresh lilies sitting in a massive crystal vase on the dining table. And freshly popped champagne. Smooth jazz was playing from hidden Bluetooth speakers, filling the room with a synthetic, easy rhythm that completely masked the sound of the water lapping against the hull. Richard was already in his element. He was standing by a marble-topped wet bar, aggressively pouring drinks for Marcus, David, and Sylvia. He was laughing entirely too loudly at a joke David had just made. He looked like a man who believed he had already conquered the world simply because he rented a piece of it for the weekend. I walked quietly past the main seating area. Nobody offered to take my bag. Nobody handed me a drink. That was perfectly fine with me. I did not want their champagne. And I certainly did not want to make small talk with people who looked at me like I was a misplaced piece of furniture. I found my assigned cabin on the lower deck. It was ridiculously plush. With thick carpeting and a bed covered in silk pillows, I dropped my heavy canvas sea bag onto the floor. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. I did not bother unpacking Lay. I just took a deep breath, turned around, and walked right back up the stairs. You have to understand something about being a captain. You never truly clock out. The moment you step onto a floating structure, your brain automatically begins to calculate risk. It is not something you choose to do. It is an instinct forged over 40 years of keeping people alive in hostile environments. I needed to see how this ship was run. I walked up to the top deck and leaned against the polished teak railing, staying out of the way. Just watching the crew prepare for departure, they did not look like sailors. They looked like they had been cast for a television commercial. The deckhands were young, tanned, and wearing matching pristine white shorts with navy polo shirts. I watched one of them secure a spring line to a heavy metal cleat. It was a sloppy, hurried knot. He did not lock it down properly. If a sudden surge of water hit that line, it would slip loose in a matter of seconds. He did not even double-check his work before jogging back to the galley to fetch more ice for Richard's guests. Then, I walked past the bridge. The bridge on the apex return was a massive, air-conditioned glass enclosure. Through the open side door, I saw the man in charge. Captain Brody. He could not have been more than 28 years old. His uniform was absolutely spotless, and his hair was perfectly styled. But that was not what bothered me. What bothered me was where his eyes were fixed. He was not looking out the massive windshield at the harbor traffic. He was not checking the horizon. He was staring straight down at a glowing tablet computer mounted to his center console. He was tapping the screen, swiping through menus, entirely absorbed in the digital representation of the world rather than the real one right outside his window. I let my eyes wander around his command center. I saw the beautiful, heavy brass analog barometer mounted on the back wall. It was pushed into a corner, and it looked like it had not been wiped down in months. He was not using it. The VHF marine radio, which is the absolute lifeline of any vessel on the water, was turned all the way down. The constant, crackling updates from the Weather Channel and the Coast Guard had been silenced. Why? Because the smooth jazz from the passenger lounge was piped directly into the bridge, and the radio static would have ruined the vibe. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. A ship does not care how much money you paid to rent it. The ocean does not respect digital readouts or expensive fiberglass. The ocean only respects preparation. And this vessel was entirely unprepared. I looked for the life rafts. On a working freighter, the life rafts are front and center, completely unobstructed, ready to be deployed the second things go wrong. On this floating palace, they were tucked away behind sleek, aesthetic fiberglass panels so they would not ruin the visual lines of the yacht. If you need a life raft, you usually have about 60 seconds to get it into the water. You do not have time to figure out a hidden luxury latch. I felt the deep rumble of the engines starting. Even that was heavily muffled, insulated, so the wealthy guests would not have to endure the vibration of mechanical reality. Richard walked out onto the deck. Holding a fresh mimosa, he saw me standing near the bridge and sighed, rolling his eyes slightly. "Marguerite," he said, using his loud, condescending host voice. "We are pulling out. Why don't you go sit down in the lounge? Find a soft chair. We wouldn't want you losing your balance before we even clear the breakwater. I am fine right here?" "Richard," I said evenly. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the horizon. He scoffed, shook his head, and walked back to his investors, probably to make another joke about my age. He mistook my silence for submission. He believed, with that absolute, unassailable arrogance that defined his entire life, that he was in total control of this environment. He had paid for smooth sailing, so he believed the universe was obligated to give it to him. But as the apex return slipped out of the protected harbor and the bow hit the first real swell of the open Atlantic, I felt a familiar ache deep in my right knee. The sky above us was still a brilliant, blinding blue, but the barometric pressure was already dropping. The air was getting thick. Captain Brody kept his eyes on his iPad. Richard kept pouring champagne, and I just stood quietly by the railing, bracing my boots against the deck, waiting for the reality of the ocean to finally catch up with them. By 7 o'clock that evening, the sun began to set. It did not turn the sky a beautiful postcard pink. It turned the horizon a flat, heavy, bruised purple. To a tourist, it just looks like the end of the day. To a sailor, it looks like a warning. The barometric pressure was dropping steadily. I could feel it in the dull ache of my right shoulder. A souvenir from a rough cargo run across the Bering Sea 20 years ago. Dinner was served in the main dining salon. It was a ridiculous room for a boat this size. Paneled in dark mahogany with a massive crystal chandelier hanging over a long, polished dining table. The crew had set the table with heavy silver cutlery and tall crystal water glasses. It felt like sitting in a high-end steakhouse that just happened to be floating. Richard sat at the head of the table. Naturally. Elena sat to his right, looking tense. Picking at her expensive salad, the investors, Marcus, David, and Sylvia, were seated near the center, laughing loudly at something Richard had just said. I was placed at the very far end of the table, closest to the heavy glass doors that led out to the aft deck. That suited me perfectly. I could watch the dark wake of the boat and feel the rhythm of the water beneath my boots. The ocean was already starting to roll. It was a long, slow, heavy swell. The yacht's automated stabilizers were working overtime to keep the dining room floor flat, compensating for the movement. But I could feel the mechanical hum of the effort vibrating directly through the floorboards. Halfway through the main course, Richard stood up. He picked up his champagne glass and tapped it with his silver fork. The sharp, high-ringing sound cut right through the smooth jazz playing from the hidden speakers. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment, Richard announced. His voice was incredibly loud, projecting across the room as if he were addressing a crowded auditorium instead of a private table of 6 people. Marcus and David looked up, polite but expectant. Sylvia stopped feeding bits of expensive roasted beef to her dog. I just want to formally welcome Marcus, David, and Sylvia to the Apex return, Richard said, flashing a brilliant, heavily practiced smile. When we started talking about this new commercial real estate syndicate, I knew we needed to get out of the boardroom. I wanted to bring you out here, onto the open water, because business, just like the ocean, requires a strong hand at the wheel. It requires a captain who knows how to navigate rough waters and bring the ship safely into port. He paused, letting his terrible, cliché metaphor hang in the highly air-conditioned air. I kept my eyes on my glass of ice water. The surface of the water was tilting, just a fraction of an inch, back and forth. The swell was getting larger. And speaking of captains, Richard continued, turning his gaze down the long table directly toward me. His smile turned into a sharp smirk. We actually brought our very own seasoned sailor along for the ride. Well, seasoned in the harbor. Anyway, he chuckled loudly at his own joke. David let out a small, obligatory laugh. Make sure my mother-in-law stays seated tonight. Everyone, Richard said, his voice dripping with loud, patronizing amusement. She is only used to little dinghies in the harbor. We do not want her getting seasick on a real vessel like this and ruining the expensive upholstery. A heavy, awkward silence immediately fell over the dining room. Elena squeezed her eyes shut for a second, her hands gripping her linen napkin tightly in her lap. She looked absolutely humiliated. Sylvia raised a perfectly plucked eyebrow and took a slow sip of her wine, looking at me with a mixture of quiet pity and mild disgust. Richard stood there, his chest puffed out, holding his champagne glass. He thought he looked incredibly strong. He believed that by stepping on me, by publicly reducing me to a frail, foolish old woman, he was proving his own dominance to these high-net-worth investors. He was establishing the hierarchy. He was the master of the universe. And I was just the charity case who needed to be managed. I did not react. I did not frown. I did not defend myself. I did not tell him that I had spent 40 years commanding vessels that carried more steel than the entire skyline of his little real estate empire. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the table. I looked him dead in the eye. I was completely, utterly calm. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was expecting me to look embarrassed. He was expecting me to look away. Or perhaps to get angry and cause a scene, which he could then use to further prove how unhinged and out of place I was. But my absolute, heavy silence completely derailed his momentum. He quickly cleared his throat, raised his glass a little higher, and pivoted back to Marcus, to smooth sailing, and to incredibly profitable partnerships. He proclaimed loudly. They all raised their glasses. Here? Here. David muttered. Richard sat back down, visibly relieved that his toast was over. He mistook my silence for surrender. He believed, with that absolute, unassailable arrogance that defined his entire life, that he had won the exchange. He felt he had firmly put me in my place. But as the waiter came around to clear our plates, I looked past Richard, out the massive windows of the salon. The bruised purple sky had turned completely black. The wind was picking up, hitting the thick glass with a low, hollow thud. I knew exactly what that sound meant. The weather was not just turning, it was collapsing. Richard thought he was the captain of his fate tonight. He had absolutely no idea that the ocean was about to demand an audit of his actual competence. And his account was entirely empty. The rest of the dinner proceeded in exactly the way Richard had orchestrated. The heavy, awkward silence that followed his toast slowly dissolved into the clinking of heavy silver forks against expensive porcelain plates. Marcus and David went back to discussing their commercial real estate portfolios, and Sylvia resumed slipping tiny, expensive pieces of roasted meat to her dog under the table. Richard leaned back in his heavy mahogany chair. He unbuttoned the middle button of his custom-tailored suit jacket and let out a long, satisfied exhale. I watched his shoulders drop. I watched the tension completely leave his jaw. He mistook my silence for absolute surrender. He believed, with the arrogant, unassailable certainty that had defined his entire adult life, that he had won. He looked down the length of that massive dining table and saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a frail, quiet, 69-year-old woman who had been firmly and publicly put in her place. He thought he had successfully established the social hierarchy of the weekend. He was the master of the vessel, the wealthy provider, the man in total control of the environment, and I was just the embarrassing charity case who lacked the intelligence or the courage to defend herself. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel angry. Anger is a remarkably useless emotion when you are on the water. Anger makes you impulsive. Anger makes you blind to the subtle shifts in your environment. I just sat there, eating my meal in total silence, observing him the way a seasoned sailor observes a changing weather pattern. Men like Richard do not actually understand power. They only understand the performance of power. They think leadership is about having the loudest voice in the room. They think respect is something you can purchase with a black credit card and a rented yacht. They build their entire identities on the assumption that the world will always yield to their money and their ego. But the ocean does not care about your investment syndicate. The ocean does not care how much your watch costs. And it certainly does not care how loudly you can project your voice in a climate-controlled dining room. As the waiter came around to pour another round of vintage champagne, I felt a distinct, heavy shudder run through the floorboards of the salon. It was not a violent movement. Not yet. It was just a slow, deep roll. The kind of movement that tells you the ocean is no longer playing along with your plans. The automated stabilizers beneath the hull whined. A high-pitched mechanical sound that I could feel vibrating right through the thick soles of my steel-toed boots. Richard did not notice the shudder. He was entirely too busy telling David a long, exaggerated story about a zoning board meeting he had recently dominated. He was gesturing wildly with his crystal flute, spilling tiny drops of champagne onto the pristine white tablecloth. Elena noticed, though. She looked down at her water glass. The surface of the water was tilting, swaying back and forth in a slow, rhythmic dance. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a silent, familiar anxiety. I gave her a very small, barely perceptible nod. I just wanted her to know that I was watching. I wanted her to know that she was not alone. When dessert was cleared, Richard clapped his hands together, the sound echoing sharply in the enclosed space. "All right, everyone," he announced. His face flushed from the wine and the sheer intoxication of his own perceived brilliance. "Why do we not take our drinks out to the aft deck lounge? The crew set up the heat lamps. We can enjoy the ocean air before turning in." The guests murmured in polite agreement and began pushing their chairs back. Richard stood up and walked past me, not even bothering to look down. He had already dismissed me from his mind entirely. I had served my purpose. I had been the prop he needed to elevate himself in front of his investors. And now I was completely irrelevant. I waited until they had all filed out through the heavy glass doors before I stood up. I did not follow them to the aft deck. I had absolutely no desire to sit under artificial heat lamps and listen to Richard congratulate himself for renting a boat. Instead, I walked quietly down the carpeted stairs to the lower deck. The air down here felt different. It felt heavier. The synthetic smell of the citrus cologne was fading, replaced by the faint, metallic scent of the massive diesel engines working just on the other side of the bulkhead. I walked into my cabin and shut the door. The room was softly lit, the silk pillows perfectly arranged on the massive bed. I walked straight past the luxury and went to my canvas sea bag sitting on the floor. I reached inside and pulled out my heavy brass barometer. I set it down on the polished wooden nightstand. I tapped the glass face twice with my index finger. A habit I had formed 40 years ago on my very first cargo run. The needle had dropped sharply. It was not a gradual decline. It was a steep, aggressive dive indicating a massive and rapid loss of atmospheric pressure. We were not just sailing into a patch of rough weather. We were sailing directly into a heavy squall line, a violent wall of wind and water that builds up quickly and hits without warning. I looked out the small porthole window in my cabin. It was pitch black outside. There were no stars. There was no moonlight reflecting off the water. There was only a thick, suffocating darkness, pressing against the thick glass. I did not put on my silk pajamas. I did not crawl into the soft, luxurious bed. I sat down in the small armchair in the corner of the cabin. I kept my thick denim jeans on. I kept my heavy woolen sweater on. I reached down and tightened the laces on my steel-toed boots. Upstairs, Richard was probably laughing. He was probably smoking a cigar and telling his investors that tomorrow would be a beautiful day for finalizing their contracts. He was completely insulated by his own arrogance, entirely blind to the reality building just beyond the reach of his deck lights. I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands in my lap. I closed my eyes and listened to the deep, steady rhythm of the hull cutting through the rising swells. I knew exactly what was coming. And I knew that when it arrived, all the money and all the loud voices in the world would not be enough to save them. They were going to have to rely on the quiet old woman they had just spent the entire evening treating like a fool. I just sat there in the dark. And I waited. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the small armchair in my cabin, my steel-toed boots laced tight, and I just listened. When you spend 40 years on the water, you do not need to look out a window to know what the ocean is doing. You can feel it in the soles of your feet. You can hear it in the way the hull groans against the waves. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the slow, rhythmic rolling had completely vanished. It was replaced by a sharp, chaotic cope. The automated stabilizers beneath the floorboards were whining constantly now. A high-pitched mechanical scream as they desperately tried to keep the luxury yacht completely level. They were fighting a losing battle. The ocean was waking up, and the apex return was entirely too top-heavy to handle it gracefully. When 6 o'clock arrived, I stood up and walked over to the nightstand. I tapped the glass face of my brass barometer one more time. The needle had not just dropped, it had plummeted. I left my cabin and walked up the heavily carpeted stairs to the main deck. The ship was quiet. The smooth jazz had finally been turned off. And the thick, heavy silence in the enclosed hallways felt suffocating. I pushed open the heavy glass doors leading out to the aft deck and stepped into the morning air. There was no sunrise. The sky had shifted from a bruised purple to a sickly, yellowish gray. The air was incredibly thick and unseasonably warm. It smelled heavily of ozone and churning salt. The metallic scent that always precedes a violent tearing of the atmosphere. The ocean was completely black, covered in whitecaps that were being whipped off the tops of the waves by a rapidly shifting wind. I walked up the exterior stairs to the top deck, keeping my balance perfectly centered as the deck pitched sharply beneath me. I headed straight for the bridge. The door to the glass-enclosed command center was slightly ajar. Captain Brody was standing at the helm. He was holding a small ceramic espresso cup, looking intensely irritated by the movement of his vessel. He was not looking at the violently shifting sky. He was entirely focused on the glowing digital screens mounted to his pristine white dashboard. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Brody jumped slightly, spilling a few drops of his espresso onto his perfectly clean white uniform. He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and profound annoyance. "Mom, passengers are not allowed on the bridge," Brody said, his voice tight. "We are experiencing a little bit of a rough chop this morning. You really need to go back downstairs and stay seated." I did not move. I looked past him, out the massive windshield. The horizon was disappearing behind a solid, black wall of heavy clouds moving toward us at an impossible speed. "That is not a rough chop, Captain," I said evenly. My voice was entirely calm. I was not asking a question. I was stating a maritime fact. That is a squall line. The barometric pressure has fallen off a cliff in the last 4 hours. You are sailing directly into a severe localized front. Brody Sahil. He set his ceramic cup down and looked at me the way you would look at a confused child. He reached out and tapped the glossy screen of his mounted tablet. "Mom, I appreciate your concern," he said, dripping with loud, practiced condescension. "But I have top-of-the-line, satellite-linked weather software right here. The radar is completely clear. It is just a passing morning drizzle. The software says we will have blue skies in 20 minutes. Now, please, return to the passenger lounge." I looked at his glowing screen. The digital radar showed an empty green circle, but I did not need a piece of software to tell me what was happening. Radar software is built on algorithms and delayed satellite sweeps. It completely misses fast-moving, low-altitude squall lines that build up from sudden temperature inversions. Software is blind to reality until it is already too late. "Your software is wrong," I said quietly. "Look at the water. The wind is shifting laterally. You need to change your heading right now." You need to take these waves on the bow, not on the beam. If you let that front hit us broadside, this vessel is going to roll." Before Brody could respond, the heavy glass door at the back of the bridge slid open. Richard stepped inside. He was wearing a silk dressing gown over his clothes, holding his own cup of coffee. His face was slightly pale, his jaw tight. He was clearly feeling the motion of the ocean, but his ego refused to let him admit it. "Brody, what is going on up here?" Richard demanded loudly, trying to project his usual authority. "My investors are trying to eat breakfast, and plates are sliding off the table. I paid for a luxury cruise, not a carnival ride." Then Richard saw me standing there. His eyes narrowed, and a cruel, entirely arrogant smile spread across his face. "Marguerite." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Are you up here bothering the captain with your fishing harbor superstitions? Are you telling him about the time you caught a big bass in a rainstorm?" He looked at Brody and rolled his eyes dramatically. It was another performance. He was using me, once again, to bond with another man, to establish his own dominance by putting me down. The lady was just leaving. "Mr. Vance," Brody said, eagerly playing along with Richard's condescension. "She was trying to tell me my radar is broken because she does not like the look of the clouds." Richard laughed. It was a loud, hollow sound that echoed terribly against the thick glass of the bridge. He felt incredibly powerful. He believed he was completely in control of the situation. He thought he had successfully put the foolish old woman back in her place. "Go sit down, Marguerite," Richard commanded, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "Leave the navigating to the professionals. We do not want you panicking and upsetting the guests." I looked at Captain Brody. I looked at Richard. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not try to convince them. When men are that deeply intoxicated by their own arrogance, words are completely useless. They were entirely committed to their own destruction. "All right, Richard," I said softly. I turned around and walked out the heavy glass door. I did not go to the passenger lounge. I went straight to the main deck, found a heavy structural pillar near the center of the vessel, wrapped my arm around a solid steel handrail, and braced my boots against the deck. They had exactly 5 minutes of their false triumph left. I walked down the exterior stairs from the bridge and found a heavy structural steel pillar near the center of the main deck. I wrapped my right arm securely around the cold metal handrail and braced the heavy soles of my boots against the teak wood. I did not go back inside to the heavily air-conditioned passenger lounge. When you know a vessel is about to take a violent hit, the absolute worst place you can be is inside a room filled with loose, heavy furniture and decorative glass. I just stood there and watched the horizon completely disappear. When a severe squall line hits, it does not build up slowly. It does not give you time to casually finish your coffee and discuss the weather. It drops on you like a concrete block. The air around me suddenly turned freezing cold, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. The water immediately surrounding the hull turned from a deep, heavy black to a violently churning, foaming white. But the most dangerous shift was the wind. It did not just increase in speed, it completely changed direction. It was no longer blowing across the bow, it had shifted laterally, hitting the apex return directly on the beam. It was the worst-case scenario I had just warned the young captain about because he had refused to change his heading. He was about to let a massive wall of wind and water strike the weakest, broadest side of his top-heavy luxury yacht. Through the thick glass doors of the main dining salon, I had a perfectly clear view of the interior. Richard was in there. He had actually managed to herd his wealthy investors Marcus, David, and Sylvia. To the breakfast table. I could see the heavy mechanical strain on the yacht's automated stabilizers. The floor of the dining room was already tilting at a harsh angle. But Richard was completely ignoring it. He was standing up at the head of the table, holding a silver coffee pot, trying to pour a cup for Marcus. He was putting on a desperate, entirely fabricated performance of absolute control. I watched his mouth moving. I could not hear his voice over the rising, mechanical howl of the wind outside. But I could read his body language perfectly. He was smiling. He was gesturing casually with his free hand. He was probably making another loud joke about my age, telling his high-net-worth clients that his frail mother-in-law was hiding down in her cabin because she was afraid of a little morning drizzle. He believed the thick glass of the salon made him completely invincible. He was entirely committed to the illusion of his own dominance. Even as the silver coffee pot shook violently in his hand, spilling hot brown liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. He kept that arrogant, plastic smile plastered across his face. Sylvia was gripping the edges of her mahogany chair, looking visibly pale. Her tiny dog was nowhere to be seen, likely locked in a carrier downstairs. Marcus and David were no longer laughing at Richard's jokes. They were looking nervously at the massive glass windows, realizing that the blue sky they had been promised was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, bruised darkness. But Richard just kept talking. He refused to yield to the reality of the situation because yielding meant admitting he was wrong. Yielding meant admitting he was not the master of the universe. I tightened my grip on the steel handrail. I bent my knees slightly, dropping my center of gravity down into my boots. Then, the sky simply tore open. The wind hit the broadside of the yacht first. It did not sound like wind. It sounded like a freight train, driving directly over the top deck. The sheer, concussive force of the air mass slamming into the tall fiberglass structure caused the entire vessel to groan in protest. The high-pitched whine of the automated stabilizers instantly changed into a sickening, grinding crunch as the mechanical fins beneath the hull were entirely overpowered by the ocean. And then the wave hit us. It was a rogue, lateral swell generated entirely by the sudden pressure drop, moving incredibly fast and carrying thousands of tons of heavy, angry Atlantic water. It slammed directly into the starboard beam of the Apex Return. The vessel did not just roll, it was violently shoved. The deck beneath my boots pitched sideways at a terrifying 30-degree angle. I held onto the steel pillar as the entire world violently tilted. A massive sheet of salt water sprayed over the top deck, raining down on me in heavy, freezing sheets. Through the glass doors, I watched Richard's entire illusion of control shatter in a fraction of a second. Gravity instantly reclaimed the dining room. The heavy silver coffee pot flew out of Richard's hand, crashing into the wood-paneled wall. Marcus fell backward, his heavy mahogany chair tipping completely over, sending him sprawling onto the carpet. The entire breakfast buffet simply gave way. Dozens of tall crystal water glasses, heavy porcelain plates, silver trays of eggs and pastries, and that massive crystal vase full of fresh lilies slid violently across the long dining table. They hit the floor in a massive, chaotic explosion of shattering glass and flying food. The smooth jazz playing from the hidden speakers cut out instantly as the local electrical breaker tripped. The bright, warm lighting in the salon flickered and died, plunging the room into the same sickly, bruised gray light that was raging outside. Richard was thrown off his feet. He slammed hard against the interior bulkhead. Slipping on the spilled coffee and shattered crystal, I watched him scramble on his hands and knees, his expensive silk dressing gown soaking up the mess on the floor. The smug, unassailable arrogance was completely wiped from his face. It was entirely gone, instantly replaced by absolute, primal, unedited terror. He looked around wildly, screaming something I could not hear. Completely abandoning any pretense of leadership, he did not try to help Marcus up. He did not check on Elena, who was gripping a handrail near the hallway. He just curled into the corner, his eyes wide with absolute panic. I did not fall. I did not scream. I did not panic. I just stood there on the soaked exterior deck, my boots anchored firmly to the wood, the salt water dripping from my gray hair. I watched the ocean rip away every single layer of Richard's fake authority, leaving exactly nothing behind. I stood outside on the soaked exterior deck for exactly 10 seconds after the first wave hit. When a severe squall line strikes, the first wave is almost never the worst one. It is just the ocean knocking on the hull to see exactly how strong the hinges are. I knew the second wave would be much bigger. And if we were still taking the wind directly on our broadside when it arrived, this top-heavy luxury yacht was going to completely roll over. I let go of the heavy steel pillar and moved toward the glass doors of the main dining salon. Walking on a violently pitching deck is not about physical strength. It is about timing. You have to wait for the vessel to roll. Plant the heavy soles of your boots, and move decisively before the deck pitches back the other way. I have done it in typhoons off the coast of Japan. Doing it on a rented fiberglass party boat felt incredibly strange. But the absolute physics of the ocean are exactly the same everywhere. I grabbed the thick handle of the glass door and pulled it open. Stepping inside the salon, the atmosphere in the room had completely shattered. The expensive, climate-controlled air that smelled like citrus cologne and fresh lilies was entirely gone. The room now smelled like raw ozone, shattered porcelain, and absolute, undeniable panic. The local electrical breaker had tripped when the water hit, killing the warm overhead lights. The salon was bathed in the Sicilian air. Bruised gray light filtering in through the rain-battered windows. The floor was an absolute disaster. It was covered in an inch of sloshing seawater, broken crystal glasses, and crushed breakfast pastries. Richard was exactly where he had fallen. He was pressed hard against the interior wood-paneled bulkhead, his knees pulled up tightly toward his chest. His custom-tailored silk dressing gown was completely ruined, clinging heavily to his shaking frame. Soaked in spilled coffee and cold ocean water, he was staring at the water sloshing across the expensive carpeting, then his eyes wide and unblinking. The loud, booming, arrogant voice he had used to humiliate me just a few hours ago was entirely gone. He was making a low, whimpering sound in the back of his throat. He looked up and saw me standing there. I was completely soaked, my heavy woolen sweater dripping with salt water. But I was standing perfectly straight. He did not say a single word. He did not command me to go back to my cabin. He did not make a loud joke to his investors. He just stared at me, waiting desperately for someone to save him. I ignored him entirely. I scanned the chaotic room and found Elena. She was clinging desperately to a heavy brass railing near the interior stairwell. She looked terrified, but she was holding on. I walked over to her, keeping my balance perfect as the floor violently tilted another 20 degrees. I reached out and gripped her shoulder firmly. "Look at me, Elena," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady. "You never yell in a maritime crisis. Yelling breeds absolute chaos." She looked up, her breathing shallow and dangerously fast. "You are going to be fine." I told her, "Do not let go of this railing. Do not try to walk across this flooded room. If the ship rolls hard again, I want you to drop directly to your knees and just hold on. Do you understand me? She nodded quickly, tears mixing with the seawater on her pale face. Mom? What is happening? She whispered. The captain made a mistake. I said simply, I am going upstairs to fix it. I let go of her shoulder and turned toward the spiral staircase that led up to the bridge. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus. The high-net-worth investor Richard had been trying so desperately to impress, was clutching the back of a bolted leather sofa. He had a small cut on his forehead from a piece of flying glass. He looked down at Richard, who was still shivering pathetically on the wet floor. And then he looked up at me. In that one single, silent glance, I saw a massive commercial real estate deal completely evaporate. Marcus was a man who understood high-pressure situations, and he was watching Richard utterly crumble under the weight of one. Richard had spent the entire weekend trying to project an image of unassailable dominance, and the ocean had stripped it away in exactly 10 seconds. But I did not have time to dwell on Richard's ruined reputation. I grabbed the heavy handrail of the staircase and began to climb. The higher you go on any vessel, the worse the physical motion becomes. By the time I reached the upper deck, the pitching was incredibly violent. The entire yacht was groaning heavily. Fiberglass is strong, but it is not steel, and it does not like to be twisted. I could hear the structural joints popping and cracking under the immense pressure of the lateral waves. I reached the heavy door to the bridge and shoved it open with my shoulder. The enclosed glass command center was absolute bedlam. The smooth, quiet authority of the pristine dashboard was completely gone. The bridge was filled with a chaotic, overlapping symphony of electronic alarms. Flashing red lights illuminated the dark space. The high water bilge alarms were screaming, indicating that we were taking on water below decks far faster than the automatic pumps could clear it out. Captain Brody was still standing at the helm, but he was completely frozen. He was gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel so hard, his knuckles were entirely white. He was staring blindly out the massive windshield. The heavy rain and sea spray were hitting the thick glass so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being violently thrown against the window. The automated wipers were running at maximum speed, but they were completely useless against the sheer, overwhelming volume of water. His expensive top-of-the-line weather software had completely crashed. The digital tablet mounted to the center console was nothing but a black, dead screen. The sudden jolt of the vessel and the salt water spraying through a slightly open side window had shorted out his primary navigation link. Brody was a boy who had been taught how to drive a computer. He had absolutely no idea how to drive a ship. "Captain," I said sharply, stepping fully into the bridge. He flinched violently, turning to look at me. His pristine white uniform was soaked, his perfectly styled hair plastered flat against his forehead. His eyes were wide with the exact same primal, unedited terror I had just seen in my son-in-law. "We are losing power," Brody stammered, his voice cracking painfully. "The starboard engine is choking. We took too much water into the intake. The automated stabilizers are completely gone. I cannot get the bow around." He was panicking because his digital screens were not giving him the answer. He was desperately waiting for the machine to tell him what to do. But the machine was completely dead. "You cannot get the bow around because you are fighting the wind instead of using it," I said, my voice cutting through the blaring alarms like a heavy steel blade. I walked directly up to the main console and stood right next to him. I did not ask for his permission. I reached out and slapped my heavy, calloused hand down on the main master alarm panel, instantly silencing the screaming electronic sirens. The sudden, heavy silence inside the enclosed bridge was shocking. The only sound left was the deafening day. mechanical roar of the storm raging just on the other side of the glass. Brody just stared at me, completely paralyzed. Step away from the wheel. "Son," I said quietly. Brody just stared at me. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming volume of the crisis. He was a young man who had spent his entire brief career being told that the digital screens would always have the answer. Now, the screens were dead. The alarms were screaming. And the ocean was trying to tear his vessel apart. He did not move. He did not speak. I did not wait for him to process his bruised ego. I did not ask for his permission a second time. I stepped forward, reached out, and gripped the shoulder of his pristine white uniform. I physically shoved him away from the center console. He stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping on the wet floorboards of the bridge, and grabbed onto a handrail to keep from falling. I took my place dead center behind the helm. The steering wheel on a modern luxury yacht like the Apex Return is usually just a suggestion, most of the time. It is connected to a computer that interprets your movements and tells the hydraulic pumps what to do smoothly and quietly. But when a vessel is taking on severe lateral water and the electrical systems are shorting out, those computers become a lethal liability. They try to correct the uncorrectable. They fight the ocean instead of riding it. I ran my hands over the cold, polished dashboard. I ignored the dead tablet screen. I ignored the flashing red error lights. I was looking for the manual override switches. I found them tucked away beneath a sleek fiberglass panel, completely hidden from view so they would not ruin the aesthetic of the console. I flipped the heavy metal toggles one by one. I killed the automated stabilizers completely. I disengaged the computerized steering assist. I severed the connection between the dead software and the massive diesel engines below us. The moment I did that, the entire feeling of the ship instantly changed. The artificial, mechanical resistance was gone. Through the leather-wrapped steering wheel, I could suddenly feel the raw, terrifying weight of the ocean fighting against the rudder. The vibration of the twin engines traveling up through the floorboards was no longer a hum. It was a heavy, struggling growl. We were completely exposed, but we were finally under human control. "What are you doing?" Brody screamed over the deafening roar of the wind. "You just disabled the safety systems. You are going to snap the rudders." I did not even look at him. "Your safety systems were about to capsize us," I said, keeping my eyes fixed entirely on the black water outside the windshield. We were still taking the waves directly on the starboard beam. The yacht was pitching violently side to side, rolling 30, sometimes 35 degrees. If a particularly steep rogue wave hit us at that exact angle, the top-heavy structure would simply go over and never come back up. I needed to swing the bow directly into the teeth of the squall line. I needed to turn us into the wind. But you cannot simply crank the wheel hard and hope for the best in a severe storm. If you turn too early, the wave catches your broadside while you are caught in the middle of the maneuver. And you flip. You have to wait for the trough. You have to wait for that brief, terrifying valley of low water between two massive swells. I watched the violent, churning foam through the rain-battered glass. I waited. The deck pitched sharply to the left. A massive sheet of freezing salt water slammed against the starboard windows. The heavy fiberglass hull groaned. A sickening sound of structural stress. I did not flinch. I kept my hands light on the wheel, my boots planted firmly on the deck. I was feeling the rhythm of the ocean. It is a terrifying dance. But it always has a rhythm. "Turn the boat," Brody panicked. Taking a step toward me, "Hold your ground." "Som," I ordered, my voice dropping an octave. Then, I felt it. The crest of the wave passed beneath our hull, The bow began to drop down into the deep, dark trough. The pressure on the rudder eased for exactly 3 seconds. That was my window. I spun the wheel hard to starboard, locking my elbows and putting the entire weight of my shoulders into the turn. At the exact same moment, I reached down to the twin throttles. I pulled the starboard engine back to idle and shoved the port engine throttle all the way forward. The massive diesel engines screamed. The sound was deafening. A beautiful, violent mechanical roar that shook the heavy glass of the bridge. By running one engine at maximum thrust and cutting the other, I forced the stern to kick out aggressively. The bow of the Apex Return swung around violently, cutting through the heavy water. We turned exactly 90 degrees in less than 5 seconds. Just as the bow locked into its new heading, the next wave arrived. It was a monstrous wall of black water, easily 20 feet high, capped with violently churning white foam. But this time, it did not hit us on the weak, broad side of the vessel. We hit it head-on. The bow of the yacht slammed directly into the base of the wave. The impact was absolutely massive. It felt like driving a truck into a concrete wall. A solid sheet of green ocean water launched straight up into the air, completely swallowing the bridge. For 2 terrifying seconds, the entire world outside the windows went pitch black underwater. Brody screamed and ducked behind the navigation table. I did not close my eyes. I gripped the throttles and waited. The engines roared, fighting the incredible weight of the water. Slowly, the buoyant fiberglass bow pierced through the crest of the wave. The water cleared from the windshield, pouring off the top deck in heavy waterfalls. The vessel rode up and over the back of the swell, dropping heavily onto the other side. We did not roll. We did not capsize. We were pitching heavily up and down now. A violent, jarring motion. But it was a survivable motion. The ship was finally doing what it was designed to do, cutting through the ocean instead of being pushed by it. I pulled the port throttle back, matching it with the starboard side, establishing a steady, powerful forward momentum. I adjusted my grip on the wheel, making micro corrections to keep our bow locked directly into the shifting wind. The heavy, chaotic panic inside the bridge suddenly evaporated. The deafening alarms had already been silenced. And now the terrifying, uncontrollable rolling had stopped. We were still inside a severe squall. But the ship was no longer dying. I looked over at Captain Brody. He was slowly pulling himself up from the floor, his hands shaking violently. He looked at the compass, heading. He looked at the black waves crashing harmlessly against our reinforced bow. Then, he looked at me. All of the loud, arrogant condescension he had learned from Richard was completely gone. He was staring at me with absolute, undisguised awe. "How did you know the timing?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. I kept my eyes on the horizon. Because the ocean does not read software. "Captain," I said quietly, "check the bilge pumps. Make sure the engine intakes are clear. We have a long way to go before we see blue sky again." Down below in the passenger salon, Richard was probably still shivering on the flooded floor, completely unaware that the frail, embarrassing mother-in-law he had spent the entire weekend humiliating had just saved his life. But he was going to find out soon enough. I kept my hands securely locked on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. The ocean was still throwing 30-foot waves directly at our bow, and the sky outside the thick glass was completely black. But the sickening, terrifying lateral rolling had stopped. We were pitching heavily, driving the nose of the yacht deep into the troughs and riding up over the massive crests. But we were doing it on our own terms. I could feel the heavy, mechanical pulse of the twin diesel engines vibrating right up through the soles of my steel-toed boots. They were working hard. But they were no longer drowning. Captain Brodie was standing a few feet away, his chest heaving. He was looking at me like I had just dropped out of the sky. "Captain," I said, keeping my voice loud enough to cut through the roar of the wind, but absolutely calm. "I need you to physically go down to the engine room. I need you to check the port side water intake. We sucked in a lot of heavy foam when we turned, and I need to know if the filters are choked. Do not look at a digital screen. Use your eyes and a flashlight. And check the primary bilges while you are down there." Brodie did not argue. He did not try to pull rank or remind me that this was his vessel. The ocean had just stripped away every single layer of his unearned confidence, and he knew it. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking. He turned and hurried toward the interior stairwell, his wet, polished shoes squeaking loudly against the floorboards. As soon as he left the bridge, the secondary electrical system kicked in. The yacht had lost primary power, but the backup batteries came online with a loud, hollow click. A small, square monitor mounted to the far right of the console flickered to life. It was the internal security feed. The high-definition camera in the main dining salon was still functioning. I did not have to leave the helm to see the absolute destruction of Richard's little empire. I just glanced over at the small screen. The dining room looked like it had been hit by a bomb. The heavy mahogany chairs were overturned. The pristine white carpet was completely soaked, covered in an inch of sloshing, dirty seawater. Shattered crystal and broken porcelain were scattered everywhere. And then I saw Richard. He was exactly where I had left him. He was sitting on the floor, shoved into the corner of the room. His knees pulled up tightly to his chest, his custom-tailored silk dressing gown, the one he had worn to look like a wealthy aristocrat having a leisurely morning coffee, was ruined. It was plastered to his shivering body, soaked in freezing salt water and spilled espresso. I watched Marcus. The high-net-worth investor Richard had been desperately trying to impress, pull himself up off the floor. Marcus did not wait for Richard to help him. Marcus was a man who understood how to survive a crisis. He grabbed a heavy table leg for balance, stood up, and immediately reached down to help his wife. "Sylvia." Richard just sat there. He was completely paralyzed. All the loud, booming arrogance, all the patronizing jokes, all the desperate attempts to assert his absolute dominance over the room, it was entirely gone. He looked incredibly small. But as I watched the monitor, I saw the exact moment his ego tried to desperately reassert itself. Marcus said something to Richard. I could not hear the audio, but I could read the body language perfectly. Marcus pointed at the shattered window, then pointed up toward the ceiling. Gesturing toward the bridge, he was demanding answers. He was asking the man who rented the boat what the hell was going on. That was the trigger. Richard could not stand looking weak in front of a man whose money he wanted. I watched Richard slowly untangle himself from the corner. He stood up, his legs visibly shaking. He wiped the wet hair out of his eyes and puffed his chest out, even soaked to the bone, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of his own arrogance. He tried to put the mask back on. He pointed an angry finger up at the ceiling, nodding at Marcus, as if to say, I am going to go up there and fix this. He was going to march up to the bridge and scream at Captain Brodie. He was going to use Brodie as a scapegoat to prove to his investors that he was still the alpha in the room. He thought Brodie had made a mistake, and he was coming up to demand a refund and a return to port. I looked away from the monitor and brought my eyes back to the black horizon. I checked my compass heading. easing the port throttle back just a fraction of an inch to keep our bow perfectly locked into the wind. Less than a minute later, the heavy glass door at the back of the bridge slid violently open. "Brody!" Richard screamed. His voice was entirely too loud, completely frantic, echoing sharply in the enclosed space. The wind howled through the open doorway before he managed to slam it shut behind him. "What the hell are you doing?" Richard yelled, marching forward, his ruined silk gown dripping onto the floorboards. "My investors are bleeding down there. The dining room is completely destroyed. I told you I wanted smooth sailing. You are fired. Do you hear me? The minute we get back to the dock, I am having your license." He stopped. He stopped completely dead in his tracks, roughly 5 feet away from the command console. The words simply evaporated from his throat. Brody was not at the helm. Brody was not even on the bridge. I was standing dead center behind the wheel. My heavy denim jacket was soaked. My gray hair was plastered to my neck, but my hands were locked onto the controls with the absolute, unassailable confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Richard stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted from me to the dead digital tablets on the dashboard, to the manual override switches I had flipped, and then out the massive windshield, where a 20-foot wall of black water was currently breaking harmlessly against our bow. He could not process the image in front of him. His brain was completely short-circuiting. The frail, embarrassing, 69-year-old mother-in-law he had spent the entire weekend humiliating was standing exactly where the captain was supposed to be, keeping his multi-million-dollar rented yacht from flipping over in a squall line. I did not turn my head to look at him. I kept my eyes on the ocean. "Close your mouth, Richard," I said evenly, my voice completely devoid of any anger or panic. "And hold on to a handrail. The next wave is going to drop hard." I pulled the throttles back slightly, letting the bow dip into a massive trough. The deck pitched violently downward, and Richard lost his footing entirely. He slammed hard against the navigation table, gripping the edge with white knuckles just to stay upright. He was not the master of the universe anymore. He was just a terrified passenger on my ship. Richard gripped the edge of the heavy oak navigation table so tightly I could see the veins standing out on the back of his pale hands. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under that soaked, ruined silk dressing gown. The yacht pitched upward again, climbing the steep back of another massive swell, and he squeezed his eyes shut. He was waiting for the vessel to roll. He was waiting for the terrifying, sickening lateral slide that had completely destroyed his breakfast and his ego just 10 minutes ago. But the roll never came. I kept the bow locked precisely into the teeth of the wind. The heavy fiberglass hull shuddered violently as we broke through the crest of the wave, but we stayed entirely upright. We dropped heavily down the other side, and the twin diesel engines roared in response to my hand on the throttles. Richard slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the analog compass. He looked at the black water outside the glass. Then, he looked back at me. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his situation was finally penetrating the thick layer of unassailable arrogance he had worn his entire adult life. He was not the captain. He was not the master of the universe. He was just a terrified, freezing man standing in a puddle of his own spilled espresso, entirely dependent on a 69-year-old woman to keep him breathing. "Where is Brody?" Richard finally managed to ask. His voice was not a booming command anymore. It was a hollow, shaking whisper. "I sent him down to the engine room," I said quietly, never taking my eyes off the horizon. We took a massive amount of heavy foam into the starboard intake when your captain let the wave hit us broadside. If the filters choke, we lose that engine. If we lose that engine, we lose our forward momentum. And if we lose our momentum in a squall line this severe, we capsize in under 2 minutes. I did not say it to scare him. I stated it as an absolute mechanical fact. When you are on the ocean, facts are the only things that matter. Richard swallowed hard. He looked at the dead digital tablets on the pristine white dashboard. He looked at the manual override switches I had engaged. The entire digital illusion he had paid thousands of dollars to rent was completely dead. "Can you get us out of this?" he asked. The hesitation in his voice was profound. This was a man who had spent the entire weekend loudly proclaiming that his mother-in-law was a frail, embarrassing joke, who only belonged on a dinghy in a protected harbor. Now, he was literally begging me for reassurance. "I can," I said evenly, "but you need to stay exactly where you are. And you need to keep absolutely quiet." He did not argue. He did not puff his chest out. He just nodded. A small, pathetic motion, and held tighter to the wooden table. Just then, the backup analog VHF radio, mounted above the windshield, crackled to life. It was heavily distorted by static, but the voice cutting through the noise was clear and urgent. "Vessel Apex return. Vessel Apex return. This is Coast Guard Sector Alpha. We are tracking a severe, localized pressure drop in your grid. Do you copy? Over." Richard jumped at the sudden noise. He looked at the radio, completely clueless as to how to operate it. I reached up with my left hand, pulling the heavy black microphone from its cradle while keeping my right hand locked securely on the wheel. I pressed the transmission button. "Coast Guard Sector Alpha. This is Apex return. We copy," I said. My voice was entirely flat, completely devoid of the panic that usually flooded the emergency channels during a storm. "Apex return. What is your current status and heading? Be advised, you are sitting dead center in a severe microburst. We are reading sustained winds of 60 knots. Sector Alpha. Apex return is currently taking 30-foot seas directly on the bow." I replied, reading the analog compass, heading without breaking my visual focus on the water. We lost primary navigation and automated stabilizers. We are operating on manual override. Both diesel engines are currently functional. I am holding a heading of 045, cutting directly into the wind to avoid a lateral roll. We are holding our own. There was a brief pause of static on the other end. When the Coast Guard operator replied, his tone had completely shifted. He was no longer speaking to a panicked civilian on a rented party boat. He realized immediately, by the terminology and the absolute calm in my voice, that he was speaking to a seasoned professional. "Copy that. Apex return. Sounds like you have the helm under control. Captain, hold your heading of 045. The satellite shows you should punch through the worst of the squall line in approximately 45 minutes. Do you require immediate assistance?" "Negative." "Sector Alpha," I said, "we will ride it out. Apex return. Standing by." I hooked the heavy microphone back into its cradle. The silence inside the glass bridge was absolute, broken only by the mechanical roar of the storm outside. I glanced over at Richard. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. He had just listened to me communicate with the United States Coast Guard in a language he completely did not understand, commanding a level of instant respect that he could never buy with his black credit card. He finally understood that I had not spent 40 years feeding seagulls at a public pier. I had spent my life commanding million-dollar pieces of heavy machinery in environments that would absolutely break a man like him. He had brought me on this trip to humiliate me in front of his wealthy investors. He had wanted to show Marcus and David exactly how powerful he was by contrasting himself against my perceived weakness. "You should go back downstairs." "Richard," I said quietly, turning my attention back to the massive wall of black water approaching our bow. "Your investors are waiting for you to tell them exactly how you fix this." I watched him physically flinch at the mention of his investors. Marcus had sent him up here to demand answers. Now, Richard had to walk back down those stairs, completely soaked, stripped of every single ounce of his fake authority, and admit to the men holding the keys to his financial future that the frail old woman he had been mocking all weekend was the only reason they were not currently drowning. He slowly let go of the navigation table. He turned around and walked toward the heavy glass door. He did not look like a master of the universe anymore. He looked like a man walking directly to his own professional execution. It took exactly 45 minutes to push the vessel through the back half of that squall line. 45 minutes of holding a 60-ton fiberglass yacht entirely by feel, reading the deep troughs, and managing the heavy diesel throttles. My shoulders burned. My hands were stiff from gripping the leather-wrapped wheel, but I did not let go. I did not ask for a break. When you are the only thing standing between a ship and the bottom of the ocean, fatigue is simply not a factor you are allowed to consider. Brody came back up from the engine room about 15 minutes into the push. He looked completely exhausted. His pristine white uniform covered in a thick mixture of machine grease and salt water. He did not say a single word about his authority. He did not try to take the wheel back. He just stood respectfully to my left, holding on to the navigation table, and reported that the port intake was clear and the secondary bilges were keeping up with the water. I nodded, keeping my eyes locked on the violent black water ahead. I told him to closely monitor the starboard temperature gauge and watch for any drops in oil pressure. He did exactly what he was told. He was finally acting like a sailor instead of a software technician. Eventually, the heavy, blinding sheets of freezing rain began to thin out. The pitch-black sky directly ahead of our bow started to fracture, revealing a dull, slate-gray light filtering through the clouds. The massive, 30-foot rogue waves gradually softened into a heavy, rolling ocean swell. The violent mechanical shrieking of the fiberglass hull finally quieted down into a steady, exhausted groan. We were through the absolute worst of it. I pulled the twin throttles back slightly, letting the massive diesel engines drop from a high-pitched scream to a heavy, steady rumble. I did not turn the automated steering back on. The computer was still dead. And even if it was not, I trusted my own hands far more than I trusted a microchip. I heard the heavy glass door at the back of the bridge slide open. I did not turn around immediately. I checked the analog compass and adjusted our heading slightly to put the shifting wind firmly on our stern. Letting the ocean push us back toward the coastline instead of fighting it, Captain Brody, a deep, perfectly calm voice said, "It was not Richard. It was Marcus Vance." I looked over my right shoulder. Marcus was standing inside the bridge. His expensive, tailored clothes were completely ruined. He had a small white bandage pressed over the cut on his forehead where he had hit the table. But his posture was entirely straight. He was a man who had built a massive commercial real estate empire from nothing, and men like that do not panic when things get difficult. They just quietly analyze the situation and find the exit. Richard was standing directly behind Marcus, hovering in the open doorway like a frightened child, hiding behind a parent. Richard had gone down to his cabin, changed out of his soaked, ruined silk dressing gown, and put on a dry cashmere sweater. But the expensive dry clothes could not hide the absolute, undeniable defeat radiating from his entire body. He looked completely hollowed out. His face was pale, and his hands were tucked nervously into his pockets. Marcus did not look at Brody. He looked directly at me. He looked at my calloused hands resting lightly on the wheel. He looked at the heavy manual override switches I had flipped open. He looked at the completely dead digital screens that Richard had paid thousands of dollars to rent for the weekend. Then, Marcus looked back at Richard. The silence that filled the enclosed glass bridge was incredibly heavy. It was not the awkward, polite silence of a dinner party joke gone wrong. It was the absolute, crushing silence of a multi-million-dollar business partnership being permanently dismantled in real time. Richard told us the captain was handling a minor technical glitch. Marcus said slowly, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. He came downstairs and told us he had taken charge of the situation. He told us he had ordered the crew to turn us around and get us out of the rain. I looked at Richard. He swallowed hard, his pale face turning a sickening shade of gray. He had actually gone downstairs, stood in a foot of sloshing, dirty seawater, and lied to the men who held his entire financial future in their hands. He had tried to spin his absolute, primal cowardice into a story of alpha male leadership. He could not stop performing, even when the stage he was standing on was literally sinking. I did not laugh. I did not call him a liar. I simply let the reality of the room do the talking. Captain Brody is currently monitoring the starboard engine temperature to ensure we do not lose power. I said evenly, we lost primary navigation and automated stabilizers 45 minutes ago. I disabled the computers. We have been running on manual override to keep the bow directly into the wind, so this top-heavy vessel did not roll over and capsize. Marcus Vance nodded slowly. He did not look surprised. He looked exactly like a man who had just verified a very ugly truth. He walked away from Richard, stepped up to the main console, and stood next to me, looking out the massive windshield at the rolling gray ocean. You handled this vessel through that squall? Marcus asked quietly. I spent 40 years commanding merchant marine freighters across the Pacific Ocean. I replied, my eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. This is a very light, very fragile boat. It requires a gentle hand when the barometric pressure drops. Marcus let out a low, dry chuckle. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated respect. He turned his head and looked at Richard, who was still trembling by the heavy glass door. Little dinghies in the harbor, wasn't it? Richard? Marcus asked. His tone was not loud. It was not angry. It was something far worse. It was entirely, utterly dismissive. Richard opened his mouth, desperately searching for a way to save his ego, to save his massive real estate contract, to save the grand illusion he had spent the last 10 years building. He wanted to project his loud, booming authority just one more time. But there were absolutely no words left. The ocean had stripped him completely bare, and I had simply stood quietly at the wheel and let his most important investor see exactly what was left underneath. Marcus Vance did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Men who actually possess real power never need to scream to make themselves heard. He just stood there, in his ruined, tailored suit, bleeding slightly from his forehead, and looked at Richard with a cold, absolute finality. I kept my hands lightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. Feeling the heavy mechanical pulse of the diesel engines, the yacht was still pitching over the leftover ocean swells. But the violent danger had passed. I did not interrupt. I did not look away from the gray horizon. I just listened. I have been investing in commercial real estate for 35 years. Marcus said, his voice barely rising above the low rumble of the engines. Do you know what the absolute most important metric is? Richard, it is not the profit margin. It is not the location. It is how a man handles a sudden drop in pressure. Richard swallowed hard. He reached a shaking hand up to wipe the cold sweat from his neck. His expensive cashmere sweater looked ridiculous on him now, like a costume he had stolen from a much braver man. "Marcus, please," Richard stammered, his voice thin and incredibly weak. It was completely chaotic down there. "I was just trying to keep everyone calm in the salon. I thought Captain Brody had everything under control, and I was just trying to manage the situation on the floor." "You did not manage anything," Marcus interrupted. His tone was completely flat, completely devoid of any sympathy. "You cowered in a corner while your guests bled on a glass-covered floor. You let your own wife cling to a handrail without offering her a single ounce of help. And then you walked downstairs and tried to steal the credit from the woman who actually saved our lives." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely out of ammunition. He could not make a loud joke to deflect the tension. He could not pour an expensive glass of champagne to distract them. The ocean had stripped away every single piece of his artificial armor, leaving exactly nothing but the truth. "The syndicate is completely off." "Richard," Marcus said quietly, "I am pulling my capital. David is pulling his capital. I do not partner with men who panic in the dark and lie in the light." The silence that followed that statement was incredibly heavy. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of a multi-million-dollar empire instantly turning into dust. Richard had spent the entire weekend trying to establish his dominance, trying to prove how small and insignificant I was, just to secure this exact investment, and he had lost it all in less than an hour. Not because the market turned, but because his own character had fundamentally failed. Marcus did not wait for a response. He had delivered his verdict, and he was completely finished with the conversation. He gave me one more slow, respectful nod, turned around, and walked out the heavy glass door to go check on his wife. Richard was left standing alone in the doorway. He looked entirely hollowed out. He looked at the dead digital screens on the pristine white dashboard. He looked at the heavy brass manual override switches I had flipped. Finally, he looked at me. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. Nor did I offer him a single word of insult. I simply kept my eyes on the water, my hands steady on the wheel, guiding the vessel through the remaining chop. My silence was not a punishment. It was just a reflection of his absolute irrelevance in that moment. He slowly backed out of the bridge, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind him. He did not go back to the main salon to face his former investors. He went straight down the stairwell, disappearing into the lower decks, hiding in the dark. For the next 2 hours, I stayed at the helm. Captain Brody eventually came back up from the engine room. He was covered in sweat and mechanical grease, looking exhausted but entirely focused. He stood quietly beside me, checking the analog gauges and reporting the oil pressure and engine temperatures exactly as I had instructed him to. Slowly, the bruised, sickly gray sky began to fracture completely. Bright, piercing rays of morning sunlight broke through the heavy cloud cover, striking the churning black water and turning it back into a deep, brilliant blue. The wind died down to a gentle breeze, and the violent ocean swells softened into a long, lazy roll. "The systems are completely stable, ma'am," Brody said quietly, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "The bilges are keeping up. The port intake is totally clear." I nodded. I looked at the young captain. He had learned more about the reality of the ocean in the last 3 hours than he had learned in his entire Maritime Academy career. He had learned that software does not save lives, and that arrogance is the heaviest anchor a man can carry. "Take the wheel, Captain," I said softly. Stepping back from the center console, Brody hesitated for a split second. then stepped forward and placed his hands reverently on the leather-wrapped wheel. He did not reach for his iPad. He did not try to turn the automated steering back on. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the horizon, feeling the weight of the vessel in his own hands. "Hold a heading of 270. I told him, "Keep the waves on the stern. Take us back to port." "Yes, Captain," Brody replied, his voice filled with absolute respect. I turned around and walked out of the glass-enclosed bridge. I stepped out onto the exterior top deck. The air smelled completely different now. The heavy, metallic scent of ozone was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of salt water and fresh sunshine. I walked slowly down the exterior stairs to the main deck. The luxury yacht was a complete disaster zone. The pristine white fiberglass was scuffed and battered. Expensive outdoor cushions were floating in the flooded scuppers. But the vessel was entirely in one piece, and everyone was breathing. As I walked past the shattered glass doors of the main dining salon, I saw Elena. She was sitting quietly on an intact bench near the hallway, holding a dry towel around her shoulders. She looked up and saw me. She did not look like the timid, silenced woman who had boarded this boat yesterday morning. The storm had washed away a lot of things, and I could clearly see that the illusion of her husband's perfect authority was one of them. She looked at me, her eyes completely clear, and gave me a small, exhausted, but entirely genuine smile. The cruise back to the harbor took exactly 3 hours, 3 hours of absolute, heavy silence. The smooth jazz was entirely gone. The clinking of expensive crystal and the loud, booming laughter of wealthy men were completely gone. The only sound left on the Apex return was the steady, exhausted thud of the twin diesel engines and the water rushing past the battered fiberglass hull. I sat on a wooden bench on the aft deck. Elena came out a few minutes later and sat right next to me. I did not ask her if she was okay. You never ask unnecessary questions right after a storm. You just sit there and let the reality of survival slowly set in. She leaned her head against my shoulder. It was the very first time she had done that in 10 years. When she married Richard, she had slowly built a massive wall between us. A wall carefully constructed out of his arrogant opinions and his strict rules about how a high society wife should behave. But that wall had just been completely washed away by a 30-foot wall of black water. She smelled heavily of cold salt water and fear, but her breathing was finally slowing down. Down below, in the ruined main salon, the high net worth investors were packing their bags. Marcus and David did not say another word to Richard. They did not demand an apology. They did not scream. Men of that financial caliber do not waste their breath on a bad investment once the decision is completely made. They simply cut their losses, pack their bags, and prepare to exit. About an hour before we reached the breakwater, Richard finally emerged from the lower deck. He looked absolutely terrible. The color had not returned to his face, and his expensive dry clothes hung awkwardly on his frame. He walked out onto the aft deck, holding his cell phone incredibly tight in his right hand. He was frantically pacing back and forth, staring at the screen, desperately trying to get a cellular signal. He was trying to do immediate damage control. I watched him dial a number, hold the phone to his ear, and then curse under his breath when the call dropped. He was leaving frantic, breathless voicemails for his office managers. He was trying to secure emergency bridge loans. He was trying to convince someone, anyone, that his commercial real estate syndicate was not completely dead. He stopped pacing and looked over at Elena. He expected her to stand up. He expected her to walk over, stroke his arm, and tell him that everything was going to be fine. That was her primary job in his little empire, She was supposed to manage his fragile ego whenever the real world bruised it. But Elena did not move. She just sat there on the wooden bench, wrapped in a dry merino towel, and looked right back at him. She did not look at him with anger. She looked at him with something far more devastating. She looked at him with absolute, unedited pity. Richard saw it. The hand holding the cell phone slowly dropped to his side. He realized, in that one single, quiet moment, that he had not just lost a multi-million-dollar business deal. He had completely lost the absolute control he held over his own wife. The grand illusion of his unassailable dominance was completely shattered, and he knew he could never, ever put it back together. He turned around and walked back inside the cabin without saying a single word. The sky was completely clear by the time we saw the coastline. The harbor water was flat and calm, reflecting the bright midday sun. As the Apex Return slowly navigated through the green and red channel markers and approached the private luxury marina, the contrast was almost painful to look at. We had left that dock yesterday morning looking like a glossy magazine advertisement. We were returning looking like a shipwreck. The pristine white fiberglass was covered in a thick, dull crust of dried sea salt. One of the heavy metal railings on the starboard side was visibly bent inward from the sheer force of the wave. The expensive outdoor cushions that had not washed overboard were soaked and ruined, piled in a dirty heap near the stern. The massive glass windows of the main salon were smeared with sea foam and grime. There were people standing on the long wooden docks. Other wealthy yacht owners, marina staff, tourists holding cups of warm coffee. They all stopped exactly what they were doing and stared as we limped in. They could see the heavy damage. They knew exactly what it meant. A luxury vessel does not come back to port looking like that unless the man behind the wheel made a catastrophic, amateur mistake. Up on the glass-enclosed bridge, Captain Brody was carefully maneuvering the yacht toward our assigned slip. He was not looking at his iPad. He was not relying on his automated docking software. He had the side window slid wide open, his head leaning out, judging the distance entirely by his own eyes and the feel of the coastal wind. He backed the massive boat into the narrow slip smoothly, reversing the engines with a heavy, throaty growl. He tossed the heavy mooring lines down to the two waiting dockhands. It was a perfect, completely textbook docking. As the twin engines finally shut down, the sudden silence was absolutely deafening. The heavy vibration in the floorboards stopped. We were firmly connected to the earth again. I saw the marina manager walking briskly down the dock, holding a clipboard, his eyes wide as he surveyed the exterior damage to his expensive rental. Richard's massive security deposit was going to be completely wiped out. And that was just the beginning of his financial nightmare. I stood up from the wooden bench. I did not wait for the young crew to lower the electric gangway. I grabbed the heavy brass buckles of my canvas sea bag, threw the strap over my shoulder, and walked toward the exit. The trip was over, but the reckoning was just moving from the water onto the land. I walked down the heavy wooden dock, the thick canvas strap of my sea bag digging familiarly into my right shoulder. The solid, unmoving earth beneath my boots felt entirely different from the violently pitching deck of the yacht. But I kept my posture exactly the same. Behind me, the Apex Return sat battered and groaning against her heavy mooring lines. The flashing blue lights of a Coast Guard response vehicle were already cutting through the bright afternoon sunshine. Parked directly next to the marina manager's office. When there is a severe maritime incident, especially one involving a radio check-in during a microburst, official paperwork is absolutely mandatory. I watched Richard practically sprint ahead of me. His expensive leather shoes slapped loudly against the wet wooden dock. He was desperately trying to reach the two Coast Guard officers before anyone else could. He was terrified. He knew that if the official maritime report stated he had completely panicked and lost control of his rented vessel, his insurance premiums would skyrocket. His social standing would be ruined, and his remaining business reputation would be completely destroyed. He needed to control the narrative. He thought he could spin this exactly the way he spun a bad real estate deal in a boardroom. I stopped about 15 feet away, set my heavy canvas bag down on the dock, and just listened. "Officers," Richard boomed, forcing that loud, arrogant, commanding tone back into his shaking voice. "Richard Vance, I am the one who chartered the vessel. We hit a sudden, localized squall out there, but I made sure the crew handled it appropriately. The guests were a little panicked, of course, but I kept the situation completely contained in the lower decks." He was actually smiling. He was wearing his dry, expensive cashmere sweater, standing in the bright sunshine, and trying to project the absolute dominance he had completely abandoned 3 hours ago in the dark. He believed, with that unassailable arrogance of his, that a confident voice and an expensive watch were enough to rewrite reality. Then, Captain Brody walked down the gangway. Brody did not look like a glossy brochure captain anymore. His pristine white uniform was completely ruined, covered in black machine grease, salt, and sweat. He walked straight up to the Coast Guard officers, entirely ignoring Richard's loud performance. "I am the captain of record," Brody said, his voice exhausted but incredibly firm. And this man did absolutely nothing. Richard's fake smile vanished instantly. He turned toward Brody, his eyes wide with sudden panic. "Brody, what are you talking about? I was managing the passengers. You were hiding in a corner, crying." Brody interrupted. The young captain did not yell. He just stated the absolute, undeniable fact. Brody turned back to the officers. He did not try to save his own ego either. The ocean had stripped that away from him, and he was finally acting like a real sailor. "I relied entirely on my digital radar," Brody confessed to the officers, handing over his registration clipboard. "I missed the pressure drop. I let the squall line hit us directly on the broadside. We lost our automated stabilizers. We lost primary navigation. And we were about 30 seconds away from completely capsizing." One of the Coast Guard officers raised an eyebrow, taking notes on a heavy aluminum pad. "So how did you bring her in?" "Captain?" Brody turned around and pointed directly at me. "I didn't," Brody said quietly. "She did." The two officers looked past Richard. They looked at the frail, 69-year-old woman standing quietly on the dock in faded denim jeans and heavy steel-toed boots. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to make a joke, to somehow diminish me again. But the words completely died in his throat. The senior Coast Guard officer walked right past Richard Beaver. He approached me, his eyes taking in my heavy woolen sweater and the calm, steady way I held my ground. "Mom," the officer asked respectfully, "are you the one who took the radio call for Sector Alpha?" "I am," I said evenly. "You handled that vessel on manual override through 60-knot winds?" he asked, a hint of genuine disbelief in his voice. "Do you hold a current maritime license?" I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my old leather wallet. I slid out a heavily laminated, slightly faded card and handed it to him. The officer looked down at it. He read the bold black lettering at the top, United States Merchant Marine, Master of Steam, or motor vessels of any gross tons upon oceans. It was the absolute highest certification a sailor could hold. It was a license that commanded respect in every single harbor on the face of the earth. It proved that the little dinghies Richard had been mocking all weekend were actually massive steel cargo ships that would completely crush his rented fiberglass toy without even noticing. The officer's posture instantly changed. He handed the card back to me and gave me a sharp, formal nod. "It is an absolute honor to meet you, Captain," he said. "Incredible work out there today. You saved a lot of lives." "Thank you, officer," I replied quietly, slipping the wallet back into my pocket. I looked over at Richard. He was standing completely frozen on the dock. His face was the color of dirty ash. He had brought me on this trip to humiliate me. He had spent the entire weekend trying to prove how small and insignificant I was to his wealthy friends. And now, he was standing in the bright sunlight, completely exposed, watching a uniformed federal officer address me with a level of absolute reverence that Richard could never, ever buy. Right at that moment, Marcus and David walked down the gangway. They were carrying their own heavy luggage. They did not look at Richard. They did not say goodbye. They walked straight past him in absolute devastating silence, climbed into a waiting black luxury SUV, and drove away. Richard's entire empire, his reputation, his financial future, and his massive ego had all been completely dismantled in a single afternoon. Elena was the last one off the boat. She walked down the ramp slowly, holding her small overnight bag. Richard desperately reached his hand out toward her. He expected her to follow him to his car. He expected her to play the role of the quiet, obedient wife, just like she always did. "Elena, let's go," Richard ordered, his voice thin and desperate. Elena stopped. She looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the ruined yacht, and then she looked at me. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply shook her head, stepped entirely around her husband, and walked over to where I was standing. "Mom?" Elena said softly, her voice clearer than I had heard it in 10 years. "Can I ride home in your truck?" "Of course you can." "Sweetheart," I said. I picked up my heavy canvas sea bag, turned my back on Richard Vance, and walked away, leaving him completely alone on the dock with the mess he had made. The ride back to my house was incredibly quiet. My old pickup truck does not have a climate-controlled interior or a Bluetooth sound system. It smells like old leather, spilled black coffee, and faint diesel fuel. The suspension is stiff, and you feel every single bump in the coastal highway. But as I pulled out of the luxury marina parking lot and merged onto the main road, that worn, honest truck felt like the absolute safest place on earth. Elena sat in the passenger seat. She had her knees pulled up slightly, her arms wrapped around her small overnight bag. She did not say a word for the first 20 miles. She just stared out the rolled-down window, letting the heavy, salty ocean breeze tangle her hair. 10 years ago, Richard would have scolded her for ruining her perfect blowout. He would have adjusted the air conditioning and complained about the smell of the sea. But Richard was not here. I kept my eyes on the road, my heavy steel-toed boots pressing steadily against the gas pedal. I did not ask her how she was feeling. I did not offer her any hollow platitudes about how everything happens for a reason. When a person has just watched the entire illusion of their life completely shatter, you do not fill the silence with useless noise. You just give them the space to finally breathe. About halfway home, Elena leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and began to cry. It was not a loud, hysterical sob. It was a quiet, heavy release of pressure. She was not crying because her husband had just lost a massive commercial real estate deal. She was crying because she finally realized she had spent 10 entire years shrinking herself down to fit inside the fragile, pathetic ego of a coward. She had let him dictate what she wore, how she spoke, and who she was allowed to be, all under the grand illusion that he was a strong/in capable provider. The ocean had washed that illusion away in exactly 10 seconds. "I am so sorry." "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking over the rumble of the truck engine. "I let him treat you like you were nothing. I just sat there and let him do it because it was easier than fighting him. You do not have to apologize to me." "Elena," I said evenly, keeping my eyes on the yellow lines of the highway. A bully only has power when you believe their performance. Today, his audience finally walked out of the theater. The performance is permanently over. We reached my small house on the coast just as the sun was beginning to set. I made a pot of strong black tea, and we sat at the kitchen table. We did not talk about the storm anymore. We talked about logistics. Men like Richard build their entire empires on leverage. They do not use their own money. They use borrowed capital, bridge loans, and the perceived confidence of other wealthy men. When Marcus Vance walked off that dock and got into his black luxury SUV, he did not just take his own investment capital with him. He took Richard's entire financial foundation. By Monday morning, the dominoes began to fall, and they fell with absolute, terrifying speed. Richard had been so incredibly desperate to impress Marcus and secure the new syndicate that he had severely overleveraged his own company. He had drawn down a massive, high-interest line of credit to rent the Apex return and to float the initial escrow payments for the commercial properties, fully assuming that Marcus's signature on Monday would cover the debt. But Marcus did not sign. Instead, Marcus made 3 very quiet, very deliberate phone calls to the other major investors in their circle. He did not gossip. He simply stated the absolute facts of what had happened on that vessel. In high-net-worth circles, money is important, but competence under pressure is everything. Panic is a massive liability, and Richard had just proven himself to be the ultimate liability. Within 48 hours, every single backer Richard had lined up for the syndicate completely pulled their funding. The bank holding the bridge loan panicked. When a highly leveraged commercial deal collapses that quickly, the lenders immediately moved to secure their assets. By Wednesday afternoon, Richard received a formal notice from the bank demanding immediate repayment of the line of credit. He did not have the cash. He had spent it on the yacht, the catering, and the illusion of his own wealth. He called Elena's cell phone constantly. He left dozens of frantic, rambling voicemails. He begged her to come home. He told her it was just a temporary cash flow problem, a minor setback that he was going to fix. He tried to project that loud, booming authority again, demanding that she return to the marital house immediately to help him present a united front to the creditors. Elena did not answer a single call. We did not wait for his sinking ship to pull her down with it. I had spent my entire life anticipating disasters before they arrived, and I was not about to let my daughter drown in his wreckage. On Thursday morning, I drove Elena into the city. We did not go to see Richard. We went directly to the office of a very quiet, incredibly ruthless divorce attorney. We sat in a heavy leather office, and Elena handed over the complete financial records I had told her to quietly pack before we left the marina. Because Richard had used their primary residence as collateral for his failed business loan, Elena's assets were directly in the line of fire. But Richard had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He had forged her signature on a secondary financial document 3 months prior because he believed she was too ignorant to notice, and he was too busy to explain it to her. The attorney looked at the forged signature, then looked up at me. He did not smile, but his eyes lit up with the absolute certainty of a predator who had just been handed a loaded weapon. We filed an emergency injunction and an asset freeze before the banks could officially place a lien on the house. We formally separated Elena's legal liability from his fraudulent commercial debt. Richard was sitting alone in his massive, empty house, desperately waiting for the market to save him. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet, embarrassing mother-in-law he had mocked all weekend had just systematically dismantled the very last piece of his empire. The divorce moved through the legal system with incredible speed when a man has completely lost his financial leverage. He also loses his ability to drag things out in a courtroom. The bank seized the massive marital home, auctioned off the luxury cars, and liquidated whatever was left of Richard's commercial real estate portfolio to cover his fraudulent debts. 6 months after the storm, the heavy, suffocating weight of Richard's empire was entirely gone from our lives. Elena and I did not celebrate his downfall. We simply exhaled for the first time in 10 years. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in late autumn. The coastal air was turning sharp and cold. I was sitting on my back porch, holding a warm mug of black coffee, listening to the steady, rhythmic crash of the waves against the shoreline. Elena was down on the beach, walking barefoot in the wet sand, wearing an oversized woolen sweater and faded jeans. She was no longer a perfectly polished accessory. She was finally just a woman breathing her own air. I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway at the front of the house. I did not get up immediately. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the ceramic mug down on the wooden side table, and walked through the quiet house to the front door. Richard was standing on the porch. He did not look like the master of the universe anymore. The crisp, custom-tailored linen suits were completely gone. He was wearing a plain, slightly wrinkled gray jacket and dark jeans. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant, booming confidence that used to radiate from him had been entirely hollowed out, replaced by a heavy, undeniable exhaustion. He did not puff out his chest. He did not try to force his way inside. He just stood there, looking at my steel-toed boots, before finally raising his eyes to meet mine. "Marguerite," he said softly. His voice was completely stripped of its usual volume. "Hello, Richard," I replied, my tone even and calm. I kept my hand resting lightly on the edge of the doorframe. For a long moment, the only sound was the coastal wind rustling through the tall grass in the front yard. I fully expected him to ask for a loan. I expected him to blame me for Marcus Vance pulling his capital, or to try and manipulate his way back into Elena's life. That is what a man like the old Richard would have done. But the ocean had permanently washed the old Richard away. I did not come here to ask for anything, Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. He shoved his cold hands deep into the pockets of his jacket. I needed to say it to your face." He looked out toward the gray horizon, taking a slow, shaky breath. Before looking back at me, "I spent 10 years making you feel like you were nothing," he whispered. "I brought you on that boat just to make myself look taller in front of men who did not even care about me. I thought I was so incredibly strong because I could buy things, but when the sky actually went black, I was absolutely nothing. I was a coward." I did not interrupt him. I just listened. "You did not just save my life out there, Marguerite," he continued, a single tear cutting a clean line down his pale cheek. "You showed me exactly what I actually was, and you did it without saying a single word. I am sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for how I treated you, and for how I broke Elena. It was the very first honest, entirely unscripted conversation we had ever had. There was no performance. There was no audience. There was just a completely broken man standing on a wooden porch, finally telling the truth. I looked at him. I did not feel any lingering anger. Anger is a useless emotion, and he was no longer a threat to my family. I accept your apology, Richard, I said quietly. It takes a lot of strength to stand in the cold and admit that your ship has sunk. He nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. He knew my acceptance was not an invitation to come inside. The boundaries were firmly set, and the divorce was permanent. Some things cannot be fixed. No matter how sincere the apology is, they can only be acknowledged and then left behind. Take care of yourself, Richard, I told him. You too, Captain, he whispered. He turned around, walked slowly back to his small, used sedan, and drove away down the gravel road. I watched the taillights fade into the autumn dusk. I did not feel a sense of triumphant victory. I just felt a deep, abiding peace. I walked back through the house and out onto the rear deck. The bruised purple sky was giving way to a brilliant, star-filled night. Elena came walking up the wooden stairs from the beach. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold wind, and she was smiling. It was a real genuine smile. We sat together on the porch in the quiet dark, listening to the eternal rhythm of the sea. Respect is never something you can buy with a rented yacht or a black credit card. It is not something you can demand with a loud voice. True respect is built, storm by storm, in the quiet, terrifying moments when nobody is watching. And competence is the only currency that matters. If you believe that true strength is quiet, and that absolute arrogance always sinks its own ship, hit that subscribe button and join our community. There is always another story waiting for you next week.